Hello, thank you very much for everyone joining us today for our public lecture. But before we start, I do want to just give a bit of an acknowledgement of country. So the University of Western Australia acknowledges that its campus is situated on Noongar land and that the Noongar people remain spiritual and cultural custodians of their land and continue to practice their values, languages and beliefs and knowledge. Also, if anyone's joining us from elsewhere in Australia, we would also like to acknowledge your people from those countries as well. So just a little bit about NCARD. The National Centre for Asbestos Related Diseases was established as a national cooperative research centre in 2007 in Perth, Western Australia by the Commonwealth Government. And NCARD has been continually recognised as a National Health and Medical Research Council recognised centre of excellence since that time. So we're a core team of around 30 people, researchers and clinicians who are close collaborators around Australia and internationally. And NCARD aims to enable the best Australian scientists, clinicians and researchers in the field using the best available modern technology to continue their work and cooperatively prevent and monitor, treat and cure asbestos cancers in the shortest realistic timeframe. Our vision is to lead innovation and discovery to improve the lives of people affected by asbestos-related disease. Now, joining us today, our first speaker is Renae Desai, who's a lecturer in strategic communication and health web communication at Murdoch University. Renae Desai lectures in strategic communication. Oh, the same thing again. She's a co-founder of the Australian Asbestos Network, a website that brings together historical public health and medical information about asbestos in Australia. And she specialises in digital health communication, specifically the development of an interactive website. And it's currently undertaking a PhD project which aims to develop a model for online stakeholder engagement in public health, where the AAN website is the primary case study. So give a warm welcome to Renae, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank NCARD for inviting me today to present on what is now a well over 10-year project that was originally funded through that initial setup of NCARD back in 2007. So I'm going to be speaking about how we've developed the project over time, centred on communicating asbestos risk and disease prevention through storytelling, which is how the project developed. I also would like to do an acknowledgement of country. We at Murdoch acknowledge the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation as the traditional custodians of the country and its waters, and that Murdoch University, where I work, stands on Noongar country. We pay our respects to Noongar elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge their wisdom and advice in teaching and cultural knowledge activities. So this was the original Asbestos Network website. This was decommissioned in 2015, and the only other person in the room who might recognise it is Chris Smythe, my colleague. This was produced during the first tranche of funding from 2008 to 2010. And you can see it's quite an old website. It was designed specifically to give the impression of an artistic rendering of asbestos in Australia. It's actually quite a difficult task when we gave that to the designer at the time in 2009. The original project members were Emerita Associate Professor Gail Phillips, who many of you may have met, Adjunct Associate Professor Lenore Lehman, who is our Chief Historian on the project, Professor Mia Lindgren, who was a journalist on the project and also the main chief investigator of the project along with Gail. Associate Professor Chris Smythe is sitting in the room today, and myself. And I came on board in 2009, having come out of industry, working in digital communication at the time. And I was in at Murdoch for 4 days before I had my first meeting with the team, talking about how to build a website to tell the stories of people who had been affected by asbestos-related diseases, specifically from Wittenoom and through the Asbestos Review program through Professor Bill Musk. So we were funded between 2008 and 2012. We were lucky enough to be funded by 2 consecutive NHMRC projects, which was very exciting, through Professor Musk's team. And we produced what is now an online health portal, driven primarily by historical narrative and personal stories, built following the Health on the Net code at the time. We launched it in 2010, and some of you were at the launch at Murdoch at the time, as were many of the people that we had interviewed, who of course have since passed away. It's still live. So we've generated well over 10 years worth of research data, multiple publications, presentations like these, media artifacts, including documentaries, a book, which I'll show you in a minute, and an ERA, an ARC ERA 2018 impact case study, which you can go and read about. And of course, 2 PhD projects out of that. So this is the book that was launched, I think, a year ago, before the COVID pandemic, because we had an actual launch in reality. And this was written by or edited by Lenore Lehman and Gail Phillips. And really is, other than the website, a great example of collaboration between humanities and sciences and what we can actually achieve through storytelling. Many people in the room may have read this already and actually quoted in this book as well. So I do suggest, if you don't have a copy, to get this and read it thoroughly. It gives you a good historical narrative on asbestos in Australia. So just a brief background. The original project was called Asbestos Stories, not the Australian Asbestos Network. And that was because we were looking to develop a historical archive of stories of those people who had been affected by asbestos-related diseases, specifically from Witanoo. And we interviewed people who were a part of or had a relationship with the Asbestos Review program at the time. And we wanted it to be a one-stop shop. That was our very lofty ambition back in 2009. We wanted to tell the history of asbestos in Australia by interviewing those people who had been involved in that story for a very long time. We wanted to tell personal stories of people who had suffered from asbestos-related diseases and their families and loved ones, and also provide an authoritative and credible medical and public health information portal. This was something at the time, there wasn't really a website like this in Australia. Of course, there have been a proliferation of websites, which has been a wonderful thing to see in that time, and we're now in a different period. So we brought together journalism, history, strategic communication to create this portal of evidence-based information. So we were very much aware that our job, having been given precious NHMRC money that was there to find a cure for mesothelioma effectively and prevent care options for asbestos-related diseases more broadly, we knew that we had a very important role to play and a moral obligation to use that money wisely. And so we created this experimental website, I would think. We had a few hypotheses that we wanted to test and see if we were right. And over time, those were either blown out of the water or ratified. So the material was designed to be very accessible in the almost very early stages of Web 2.0. To put it into context, Facebook had only just launched when we started designing this website. Instagram wasn't really even a thing. So we were really early on in the Web 2.0 process, 2.0 being the participative collective web. And we wanted to give people the opportunity to read about difficult information in an easy way in the privacy of their own space. The information that's on our website, as you would all appreciate, is not easy to consume. It's sometimes difficult to read, and some of it, in fact, I would say a good 50% of the content is audio related, so listening to people, which is a very personal experience. So we went about the process of pulling all of that information together, which is a large production exercise, and put that onto the website and launched it in 2010. Then in the second tranche of funding, we integrated social media, brought in Twitter and Facebook specifically, and did some experiments around that. From a community engagement stakeholder relationship perspective, we really got our boots on the ground, specifically myself and Gail Phillips, and got out and spoke to a lot of organisations working in the area at the time, the WA Health Department, the Cancer Council, the Asbestos Diseases Society of Australia, and went to as many meetings as we could to really glean from the experts what was happening in the space. And then we were invited to be on the WA Health Department Asbestos Management panel, which was a privilege, but also an interesting exercise. And they, at the time, they were changing the regulations, or going through the process of changing regulations. And we also made contact with Jeff Ferry, who was responsible for the Asbestos Management Review Program at the time. And we were able to input into that as well, which was a great exercise. So this is the new website, which we launched in 2015. It looks quite different to the previous website. And that was because of the design changes going on in the industry at the time. And all of the same information is on here. And we have found that really the number of hits, of course, have reduced over time from the peak of the project when we were in pushing out and communicating regularly. But this website has maintained a very strong readership, necessarily because of two things: the public health information and the personal stories that are on here. I have the wonderful privilege of having access to 10 years worth of web analytics for this website, so I can see how people on the internet are engaged with this content. And we can say with some certainty that for our website, personal stories have really drawn people to the content. And you can read about that in the case study on the ERA website, if you like. So this is the new project team. Myself as the project manager, Gail Phillips as our project consultant, Chris Smythe, who has come out of retirement to be our staff writer, which is very exciting. Associate Professor Terence Lee, who is a communications researcher. My colleague, Dr. Lauren O'Mani, who is an ethics expert and audience researcher. My colleague, Dr. Mark Cypher, who is gold. He is a web design and user experience researcher and practitioner, and is 2 doors down from me at Murdoch. So having somebody who can help us look after our website, and my colleague Elaine Zhu, who's also in communication research. So what is the project today? 10 years down the track, or more than 10 years down the track. Well, for the past 8 years, the project has effectively sat on the web collecting audience and creating communication research data output for the work that we do at Murdoch, and obviously for my PhD. But we have known this whole time that this is not a project that can just be shut down. We myself regularly receive emails and contact from people all over the world asking for advice, support and help. But what we are not is an advocacy group, because we are a research organisation based at Murdoch. We don't provide direct public health advice. The public health information that is on the website was created in consultation with the Health Department and the Cancer Council, and we will continue to do that. We don't at all communicate or advise on legal matters. We don't promote asbestos services either, or do any form of advertising on the website. And we don't advise on personal medical queries. I have a lot of them come to me, but we don't do that either. But what we do, and specifically myself, is I direct people to the right people to talk to. So in advocacy, the main organisation I have been connecting with people with is ADSA, the Asbestos Diseases Society of Australia in WA. But I get queries from Canada, UK, Singapore, India. Often people don't tell me where they are. And so my job is to determine and make a value judgment on who the people are, the correct way or the correct pathway for those people to get their information. And I continue to do that till only 3 hours ago. It is a job that I take very seriously, and a job that I enjoy doing, knowing that people are coming to our site still, and we can give them some help by putting them in the right direction. So this is just, I pulled this off Google Analytics a couple of days ago. It's a recent snapshot of the penetration of the site all over the world. I love this map, it's one of my favourites. Of course, Australia is the largest, but we do get regular hits from the United States. Singapore, the next one down off the screen, is the UK, Malaysia, India, and as you can see, we have hit most parts of the world where there is some sort of internet penetration. And I thought that this was just an interesting slide to show where the majority of hits are coming from. We get, number one is WA, obviously, but putting it all together, we get the vast majority is actually coming from the eastern states. And usually if someone's in Western Australia, they're happy to know that there's someone that they can go talk to directly, and I can put them in that right direction. So we've done a number of academic and industry reviews over the past decade on asbestos communication. And these are the sort of three main insights that I've gleaned from all the research and publications that we've done. One, that there's a key gap in communication and awareness, and that's the lack of understanding of how and why people make decisions about dealing with asbestos. Now, there have been some research projects done on this, which is exciting, but why does someone decide to put themselves at risk knowing that there is a risk there, and why does someone else not do that? So that's an interesting question that we have around behaviour. There's lots and lots of credible and authoritative information on the web, especially Australian, which is exciting. But we don't know enough about how people find it and then what they then do with it. And if they change their behaviour based on web information, digital information. And the key strength really is the amount of readily available information to the community that is credible and authoritative. This seems to be one area where misinformation doesn't seem to be as big a problem, but that is pre-COVID times. We'd like to see and look into what might be the case now. So what we would like to do is, and I don't want to say reinvigorate because the project is still alive and still going forward, but we're looking to develop new research proposals for new projects going forward. I personally would really like to start the development of the third wave story on our website, including personal stories. It's just something that we were not able to do in the first tranche of funding. We'd very much like to reinvigorate the medical and public health information sections of our site, which we will start doing very soon. Social media is something I'd really like to get more involved in because it wasn't part of really a big strategy in the original project. We want to do some digital media production, which is our strength. One of the key ideas I have is a podcasting series, which I'd like to develop over time, as well as more visual stories, more audio stories, stakeholder and community engagement, of course, and industry partnerships and grants. So we do have a new research trajectory, some of which we've already started, and we're very keen to re-engage with some organisations, specifically in Western Australia, to start building more content on our what has been a very successful site in this field, and what we believe can provide a value add to organisations that are spending so much time and effort on a daily basis to do this wonderful work in medical research and advocacy for people who are affected by asbestos-related diseases. So thank you very much for listening to my presentation.
Thank you so much, Renae. That was fantastic. So we're going to move now from our community and the people's perspective. We're going to go talk about the lab perspective, and doing that today is our very own Professor Richard Lake, who is a molecular immunologist with a distinguished track record in asbestos-related cancer. You can't get up that soon. We've got to give you a little bit of an intro. He's done a lot of work on mesothelioma and received national and international recognition for this work. He's one of the founding members and is now the deputy director of NCARD. And Richard works with a multidisciplinary team, preclinical team, trying to understand the mechanisms and developing new target strategies for treatment. So give a warm welcome to Richard.
Thank you, Kofi. That's very kind. And how nice to see so many different faces here, because many of you will know, right, that this is in the middle of our annual scientific meeting. So we've had the whole day, really, and thank you to my colleagues and friends from NCARD who stayed for this evening's public lecture. But we're halfway through. So in 15 minutes, I'm not really going to be able to tell you too much about all of the things that we're covering over the 2 days. But I did want to give you an idea about what's going on in terms of scientific research at NCARD. And I put our mission statement up there because I think it was something that Anna workshopped with us, and I think it's something that we all kind of feel helps us to keep our focus in research. So that's leading innovation and discovery to improve the lives of people affected by asbestos-related disease. And this is a word square, again, that the team developed. So I'm just kind of putting it up there because it just kind of gives a sense of what research at NCARD is directed towards. You'll pick up your favorite words as you look at something like that. Right, so broadly, I'm not going to tell you much about the actual research, but talk to you about how we decide what research is. So obviously the key thing in thinking about your research aims is, what do you want to know? So what do we want to know? We want to know why asbestos causes the awful burden of disease that it does. But that's too big a question. We have to define that question. And in terms of defining it, we're really thinking about how we frame it. And that led me to, this is actually a really ancient quote: theory without experiment is empty, experiment without theory is blind. It actually comes from Immanuel Kant in the 17th century. He didn't talk about experiment, he talked about experience. But actually those two things are highly related if you think about it, right? This is like your interaction with the world, and the world telling you that it's reproducible. So typically what we do in research is to collect data. So we find out as much as we can from what's available to us, and we use that data to generate a hypothesis, right? The hypothesis is the idea of why are things the way that they are. And then science really is about testing hypotheses. So we're gonna, and my take on that really is, rather than saying, you know, is it true? What we're really doing is checking if it could be otherwise. So typically, in a scientific environment, we're typically disproving rather than proving, even though it feels like what we want to know is how did A become B. Actually, what we're showing, when we can, is that it's not through mechanism CDE. Okay. Oh, I wanted to show this. So there's just a little background story, in that one of our key colleagues, Joost Lesterhaus, who's not here, is Dutch, and in all our meetings he brings to us a Dutch proverb. And I found this picture by Peter Bruegel, and this is for the students really. So anyone who thinks research is easy needs to kind of look at a few Dutch proverbs. So I talked to you about collecting the data. Right, so this is where we start. Australia carries a terrible burden of asbestos-related deaths and cancers because of our history of asbestos use and mining. Every day in Australia, 11 people die from asbestos-related disease. And so these are some of the numbers, right? So Australia is the #1, asbestos, right, causes more cancer than any other occupational effect. And Australia has the second highest incidence in the world of mesothelioma, and that's after the United Kingdom. And I think if you break that down, WA comes up higher because it's the highest within Australia in terms of incidence. And these numbers of over 4,000 Australians who die each year from asbestos-related diseases, and 3,000 who die from asbestos-related lung cancer. The number 724 mesothelioma-related deaths comes from 2019. I think the number is 766 for 2020. So it's still not getting better. We're still not past the peak of mesothelioma-related death. So this is our data collection, right? This is the problem that we're facing. And this is I guess, the bad news, right? So for those of you who are maybe not so familiar with looking at graphics like this, what we're looking at on the x-axis is the years as time goes by, and on the y-axis is how long people survive. So for all cancers, that's the green line, you can see that over the last 30 or 40 years, there've been significant improvements in survival, right? So that's gone from around 50% to around 70% of people diagnosed with a cancer who would be alive 5 years later. But then if you look at the lower line, then that's people with mesothelioma. We really have not done a great job of increasing survival in that group. So that has to be one of our key research objectives. How do we do that, right? So I've put, this is almost like, you know, eliminate asbestos from the environment, right? How easy could that be? Well, of course, we've spent years digging it out of the ground, and there are millions of tons of asbestos in all environments, and we continue to distribute it around the world by blowing things up. I think people are really good at blowing things up. But the alternative to not being able to put it back in the ground is to understand how to work around it safely. And there are groups like the Asbestos Safety and Eradication Agency who are dedicated really to providing education in that sphere, right? You're going to be working with or near asbestos. You need to know how to do that as safely as possible. And part of that is the Non-Government Asbestos Advisory Committee, which NCARD is a part of and contributes to. So I'll just come back to that mission statement: reduce the burden and improve the lives. How do we stop people? These are my, you know, questions, right? How I'm framing my research questions. How do we stop people getting mesothelioma or asbestos-related disease? How can we diagnose it earlier? Can we develop better treatments? And how can we tell if a treatment is working? All of those things, I think, we've talked about today in our science session, and we'll talk about again tomorrow, because they really are at the centre of our scientific research programme. I'm just going to talk to you about one aspect of that, which I think is central to everything that NCARD has done, and that's immunology. I think everyone now knows a little bit about immunology because we're all talking about whether we're getting vaccinated or not, and whether we've got T cells or B cells, right? I saw this picture. It's not my picture, but it's very emotive. That's a T cell, little blue cell, meeting a cancer cell, and it does feel, doesn't it, like he's kind of just checking it out. It speaks to us because it's emotive, right? And that interaction ultimately is what's going to decide a lot of treatments, how your immune system responds to your cancer, and central to our, you know, to much of our research. But I just wanted to just break that down a tiny little bit in terms of what that handshake might mean. Handshake, it's not a handshake, is it? It's kind of poke in the ribs, you know, what are you doing here? That conversation is held at the level of molecules on the surface of the different cell types. So you can see in the middle there, we've got the T cell, which many of us think is the, you know, the most important of the common effectors in much of the response that we're looking to generate. But that has to talk to a whole bunch of other cells. You can see in the top left a dendritic cell, and in the bottom right a tissue macrophage, which are again the focus of much of the discussion that we had today in the scientific meeting. And all of that conversation really is then realized, I guess, in the interaction of the T cell with the tumor cell. So how we deconstruct that conversation, how we understand what's really going on there in terms of those framing those questions, I guess, has been central to NCARD research over the last 15 or 20 years, I would say. Okay, I think that's probably as much as I wanted to say. And this is last year's picture of the research team. So there are many people here who weren't there last year, and there are many people, not many, a few people there who aren't there this year. Did I say that right? Vice versa. Hopefully someone's got a picture from this afternoon, because we'll have a, you know, because we've got this year's team. But thanks everyone. Thanks to my fellow scientists. Thanks to my colleagues in NCARD, and thank you to the people who've come to listen to this public lecture.
Okay, so we've got one final talk today, and that is from our director at NCARD, Professor Anna Nowak. So Anna is a medical oncologist, and she has been doing a lot of work with mesothelioma, and everyone who's part of this community has probably heard of Anna's name anyway already. But she's been doing a lot of research as well with NCARD. With her laboratory-based PhD thesis, she did a postdoctoral fellowship in clinical trials and quality of life research. And Anna's gained a unique translational perspective with expertise as well in the lab, which is really important. That nexus of bringing things from the lab to the clinic and back again really does help actually get to the root of the problem. She's got a long-standing research and clinical interest in malignant mesothelioma, and as the director of NCARD, Anna has led collaborations around 35 different scientific staff and graduate students, and is passionate about patient-doctor communication and mentoring and women in oncology and in science as well. So without much more introduction, I'll let Anna do the rest of the talking and give her a warm welcome.
Thank you, Kofi. And look, thanks to the people who braved a pretty wet, cold, nasty day in Perth to come along here, but also a big thank you to the people who are online. And we're really privileged to, I guess, now living in a world where people can join online, and that's an acceptable way of doing things. And we actually are being joined by people from not only other places around Australia, but other places around the world as well. So that's a great privilege. So I'm going to go back and talk about clinical trials, including just a bit of information about a bit of background about clinical trials, but also some of the trials that we're doing here at the moment at Sir Charles Gairdner Hospital. But I'll start right at the basics. You know, what is the goal of treatment for mesothelioma? Well, unfortunately, when people have mesothelioma, we are unable to cure them with any of the treatments that we have at the moment. But we still have treatments that we give by injection or radiotherapy, and the basic goal of that is to kill the cancer cells. And by killing the cancer cells, we reduce the amount of tumour, but that's actually not what's important. What's important is that by reducing the amount of tumour, we want to be able to improve symptoms, improve quality of life and prolong life, so that we're not just treating people to kill cancer cells, we're treating people to ensure that they live longer and live better. And there are a number of different ways that we can kill those cancer cells. We can use the immune system to attack the cancer. We can use chemotherapy or radiotherapy to damage cancer cells, and we can remove the cancer by surgery. Although with mesothelioma, it's very difficult to remove enough cancer cells because of the way it grows around the inside of the chest wall, around the lining of the heart. And so we're generally left with immunotherapy, chemotherapy, and radiotherapy. So in order to understand what is the best way of treating any cancer, including mesothelioma, we need to look at clinical trials, and these are research studies that find ways to improve health and cancer care. And going back to what Richard said, each study is trying to answer scientific questions. So we do also start with a hypothesis, and it's usually the hypothesis that treatment A will be better than existing treatment B. But sometimes we do clinical trials that are looking at different ways of preventing or diagnosing cancer as well. And the clinical trial comes at the end of a long research process, which usually starts with data and comes through to the laboratory, comes through to mice. And we need to then end with clinical trials to find out if what we think may be a useful treatment is actually safe and effective in preventing, diagnosing, or treating cancer. So the final pathway of clinical trials is a randomised clinical trial where you have a group of people who are all safe and appropriate to be treated and have the disease in question. And rather than saying, well, all of you, all of the young people, the people who we want to get the new treatment will get the new treatment, and everybody else will get an existing treatment, we actually need to separate those people randomly into two different groups so that we are comparing like with like, so that we have a similar number of people with epithelioid mesothelioma in each group, a similar number of elderly people, younger people, men and women, so that we can actually tell what is making the difference. Is this the treatment making the difference rather than just a difference between the two groups of people? So some people find that concept really challenging and wonder why we don't just give the new drug to everyone. Well, we do know that early testing of drugs often gives optimistic results because the people who participate in early clinical trials tend to be fitter and younger and may already be doing better because they're well enough to have a new or relatively experimental treatment. And when compared with other people with the same disease, it might look like they're actually doing better, but in fact, they may have done better anyway. So that's why the best test for a new treatment is to compare it with an existing standard. So I'm going to touch on a couple of the clinical trials that we're doing around Australia and here at NCARD through the Sir Charles Gairdner Hospital Cancer Clinic. So this one is the DREAMER trial. And if you torture the words durvalumab and chemotherapy for mesothelioma, a phase 3 randomised clinical trial, you can get this lovely acronym. Now, this is a clinical trial taking people who have never had treatment for mesothelioma before. So they can't have had surgery, they can't have had other chemotherapies or immunotherapy. It's really important for their safety that they need to have reasonable health. So people who are very unwell from their mesothelioma can't necessarily participate in a clinical trial. People who have other serious health conditions, including immune-related health conditions, can't necessarily participate either. They need to have a biopsy before they get to participate in the trial, and the reason for that will become clear later. And they also need to have what we call measurable disease. So we need to be able to see on a CT scan an area of that tumour so that we're able to judge whether the tumour is shrinking on therapy or growing despite therapy, because that is part of the decision making about whether that person continues treatment or whether they actually need to stop a treatment that isn't providing them with any benefit. So people with these characteristics are then randomised, what we call 2-to-1 randomisation. So 2 out of every 3 people will have treatment with the new combination, which is standard chemotherapy plus the immunotherapy called durvalumab. And durvalumab actually works through one of the pathways that Richard was describing in that cartoon that talked about the interaction between tumour cells and the immune system. And 1 out of every 3 people will receive standard chemotherapy, and that is 6 cycles or treatments of chemotherapy, and normally that would then just stop. Treatment would stop. There are some benefits to stopping treatment because you get to live life as normal, at least until you need further treatment. Those people who are on chemotherapy plus immunotherapy continue to receive immunotherapy for up to 2 years or until the tumour grows or there are troublesome side effects. So this is an international trial. We'll have 240 people from the US, 240 from Australia, and we've already got around 15 people from Sir Charles Gairdner Hospital participating in this study. So people often ask me, well, why are you combining chemotherapy with immunotherapy? Because we know that chemotherapy causes problems with the immune system. People on chemotherapy are much more susceptible to infection. They have to be careful where they go, who they interact with, not to get sick. However, there are actually a number of benefits that through this group and others around the world we've identified over the years. So when you give cancer cells, here we have cancer cells in the middle, chemotherapy, well, you're going to kill some of those and reduce the amount of tumour. But not only are you reducing the amount of tumour, you also, those dying cancer cells release proteins, antigens that are little parts of the tumour cell content that some of them may look different to the body, and the immune system may then be able to see and recognise them better than it did when the cancer was just sitting there and growing. So when the immune cells recognise these bits of dying cells, they then talk to each other, and this can actually enhance the immune response against the cancer. So that will put it in a good situation potentially to use immunotherapy and then further accelerate that immune response. So if there isn't an immune response there already, then maybe triggering a further immune response and the ability for the immune system to see the cancer through chemotherapy may be helpful. Those damaged cells are also more readily killed by the immune system. And even the low blood counts that we're worried about when people have chemotherapy can actually be good for tumour immunity, because it may reduce the number of cells that normally put the brakes on the immune system, and it may allow space for the accelerator cells to bounce back. So before we got to this trial, there were years of preparatory work in mice, and I'm going to summarise in a nutshell here. And also recognising that talking about experimental mice can be really challenging to people who are not used to having those conversations, but they are absolutely a vital and well-regulated and well-cared for part of cancer research. So here's 5 mice. Growing a tumour on the flank doesn't bother them. They run around just fine. And then we treat these mice with chemotherapy. And what happens is very similar to what happens in people, which is that those tumours shrink. And most of them shrink in mice, but then they grow back. It's not a durable shrinkage, and those mice have to be euthanized. With immunotherapy, it looks a little bit different. We take our 5 mice, we treat them. A couple of the tumours shrink, some of them don't. But then every now and then you have a mouse that is cured by immunotherapy. Put these two together and we were ending up with the best of both worlds. We have tumours that more uniformly shrink, but then a greater proportion of mice that were tumour-free into the long term and fewer that had to be euthanized. So here's just a couple of individual results from the DREAM trial, which was the trial we did before we moved on to the DREAMer trial. And in this trial, everybody got the same treatment. Everybody got the experimental treatment. But because it was only 54 people, this is not enough proof for regulatory authorities around the world to say, yes, everyone should be treated with chemotherapy and immunotherapy in combination, which is why we've moved on to do the larger clinical trial. So these are CT scans. In the CT, we're looking at this middle plane where the people are being cut through the middle. And here, what I'm outlining with my pointer is the tumour that's growing in between the white of the ribs and the black of the lungs. And here's another example, tumour. This is the before. This is the same person looking about 3 months later with a CT scan. And what I want to highlight here is that that area of tumour that we were looking at on the other side is almost completely gone. And this is another example from a different person, almost completely gone. See a little bit there. So we were really excited by the results of the DREAM trial that allowed us to get support internationally and from the company that makes durvalumab to carry on with the DREAMer trial. And this is where that tumour biopsy comes in. One of the things that's really important is that we do laboratory studies to identify who will get the best results from treatment. And so we look at the tumour, we look at the blood, and the goal is not only to find out who will get the best result from treatment, but how might we make treatment better. I'm just going to talk briefly about a second trial that we've got open at the moment. This is for people who have already had treatment for mesothelioma with chemotherapy. And this is in collaboration with a Norwegian group. And people then are randomly assigned to get either double immunotherapy plus an anti-cancer vaccination or double immunotherapy on its own. So everybody's getting a treatment that we know works. Some people are getting something extra that we don't know, but we don't know yet what that adds. So just to finish up, wondering, is the future personalised treatment from a portrait of an individual tumour and that individual person. And just looking at this diagram here, there's a number of things that we can measure from the blood and from the tumour. We can measure just how foreign is that tumour for the body. What is the immune status of that person? Do they have an immune system that is very activated, or are they an older person who is not responding well, not likely to respond well to immunotherapy? What does their cancer show the presence of some of those checkpoints that Richard was talking about earlier? Are there ways in which the tumour is learning to escape the immune system? And then maybe one day in the future we'll be able to put all of that together, the immunological characteristics, the tumour characteristics and the clinical characteristics, and make a recommendation for treatment that is more personalised. We do have a couple of other clinical research studies going on at the moment, and if anyone is online who's receiving care or here who's receiving care through Sir Charles Gairdner Hospital, you may be asked to participate in these. We're participating in the International Mesothelioma Staging Database to understand what the tumour looks like on a CT scan, how that relates to how well people do. We're implementing next generation sequencing in routine clinical care. People are asked to participate in the NCARD Biobank to donate a sample of blood or tumour so that we can learn more about what makes mesothelioma tick. We're also asking people who are older with mesothelioma to have a further assessment through an older adult specialist so that we can understand if in oncology and respiratory medicine we're missing something important, some issue that they may have due to their older age that may impact on our treatment. And we also are doing a study to look at ways of treating night sweats in mesothelioma, a common and tricky problem. So what does the future hold for treatment? Well, I think that one size fits all is unlikely to be the best treatment, and we've already seen that from chemotherapy and immunotherapy and chemoimmunotherapy. We know that clinical trials are the best ways to test combination treatments and understand how effective they really are. But we really need to have laboratory tests from clinical trials that help us to refine how we use those combinations. And that's one of the things that makes the laboratory and mouse research so important, because there are more combinations of possible treatments than we can possibly test in patients. So we need to start in the laboratory and take the most useful combinations through to the clinic. Final words on clinical trials. Participation is always voluntary. People are given time to think about whether they want to be part of it. But importantly, because they have those inclusion and exclusion criteria, not everybody is suitable to participate in a trial, even if they wish to. And I want to say thank you to the people who take part in the clinical trials, but acknowledge that it's also families who support them, who drive them to and from appointments, the consumer and advocacy groups and their members and supporters who often direct people to our centre or support them in their decision to participate in a clinical trial. Of course, thank you to the scientists who work towards better treatments every day, and the clinical and clinical trials teams at Sir Charles Gairdner Hospital. This is 2 years ago, ASM. It takes a team. Thank you.